Introduction to Flowcharting. Flowcharting is a method for visually communicating the flow or pathways through a computer program. While simple programs are easy enough to understand, having a flowchart of how a program works helps you to write code that works properly, and they also allow you to communicate your understanding of how a program will work to other team members. This becomes more important as your programs become more complex. Once you've got diagrams.net set up to access your Google Drive, we'll go ahead and create our first simple flowchart. Before we get started, we'll switch from the General tab to the Flowchart tab here on the left. In this exercise, we're going to create a flowchart that asks the user for a number and then responds to them to tell them if the number is greater or less than 10. There are 4 basic shapes that we'll use in our flowchart. As you learn to build more complicated flowcharts, you'll learn to use different shapes for tasks like sorting and storing data in the database. But for now, the 4 shapes we'll be using are oval or terminator. These are used for the start and end of your flowchart. The rectangle, which we'll use for most processes that the computer performs. The parallelogram, which we're going to use for all input and output of data. So anytime we want to get data from the user or display messages back to the user, we'll use the parallelogram. And finally, the diamond, which is used for decisions. The decision is used to evaluate if a condition is true or not. A decision only has 2 possible outputs, yes and no. To get started, we begin all of our flowcharts with a terminator. In this case, I'm going to drag it out and put it right in the center. I double click on it and type the word start. Then I'm going to resize that just a little bit so it doesn't take up quite as much space. Now that I've got my flowchart started, the next thing I'm going to do is ask for some user input. So I'm going to put out a parallelogram here, and I'm going to say ask user for a number. And sometimes the line breaks don't work too well, so I'll go back and press enter to break the line there. Now, the next thing I want to do is store that number somewhere in a variable. The problem is I haven't created a variable yet, so I'm just going to drag this down a little bit out of the way, and I'm going to put in a process box. It's just a rectangle, drop it into the center, and here I'm going to say user number equals 0. So I've created a variable and I've set it equal to 0. And I'll just resize things a little bit, line everything up. Now I've started my flowchart. I've set a variable equal to 0, and I've asked the user for a number. Now I want to store that number into that variable. So again, I'll bring out a process box, center it, and here I'm going to say in this process box that I'm going to store the user input in user number. And I'll resize the box just a little bit there. Now I'm starting to get the flow of my program. I'd like to show the direction of the flow in my program. If I hover my mouse over any of the shapes, you'll see that you get a little green circle shows up whenever I'm over one of those control handles. So if I go here and I click on that green and drag to another green spot, it gives me a line and an arrow that connects those 2 boxes. And so I'll go ahead and I'll do that for each of these. And once I've done that now, if I take one of these shapes and move it around, the arrows follow it and go wherever I want it to go. So this is really handy when you start to get a more complicated program and you start to change things and move things around and try and optimize the flow and just make it a little easier to understand visually. Being able to move things and have all the arrows stay connected is really helpful. So we've got some user input. We've stored it in a variable called user number. The next thing we want to do now is check to see whether that user number is greater than 10 or not. So this is where we're using a decision, and that's a diamond shape. So we bring the decision out, and because we know the diamond shape represents a decision, all we have to do here is say user number greater than 10. And since it doesn't fit very well into this box, I'm just going to resize the box a little bit so that it fits. And I'll go back and center it a little. And I'm going to connect that up to my flow. Now, when you have a decision, you only have 2 possible outputs from a decision, yes or no. So the question that you're asking here is user number greater than 10? The answer can be yes, the answer could be no. You know from math that it could be equal to 10 or it could be less than 10, but we can only have one output coming from user number greater than 10. So what that means is if we have a yes, then it means it's greater than 10. If we have a no, that means it could be equal to 10 or it could be less than 10. We can see the decision box as an if, then, else type of statement. The decision is essentially an if user number is greater than 10. The yes represents the then, and the no represents the else. So if the user number is greater than 10, I want to give the user a message that tells them that it's greater than 10. So we're going to use the parallelogram to say your number is greater than 10. And I'll have to go back and change where the lines are breaking just a little bit. And I'll connect that up. And we have to manually put in the word that says yes. So I double click in that spot, select text, and say yes. And I'll just move it a little bit closer to that line. Then the other way, if it is not greater than 10, I'm going to also give them a message. And this time I say your number is less than or equal to 10. And I'll resize the box to fit. Connect it up with arrows by going to the green, dragging to the other green circle, and double click right beside it, select text, and say no. So we can see this as if user number greater than 10, then output your number is greater than 10. Else, or no, your number is less than or equal to 10. The only thing we're left to do now is terminate our program. So we'll bring in the terminator again, type in end, resize it just so it looks like the start, and I'll go ahead and connect it up with some arrows. And that's my flowchart for checking to see whether a user number is greater than 10 or not and outputting an appropriate message.